Hello, philosophy students of early modern philosophy. Um, this is our first online lecture dealing with David Hume. As you should recall, we wrapped up with George Berkeley right before spring break, and it's time to dig in on David Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding. Since we're starting out on Hume, and as it is my custom to have picture day, I'll give you a couple of pictures of Hume. I hope you don't mind the shaky camera at work here. But here, there is David Hume, right? That's one image of the great Scottish philosopher of the 18th century. I'll give you another one. This might harken back. I think at some point I showed you an image of Thomas Reed with a turban on his head. For some reason in the 18th century, turbans worn by people in England became popular. Well, here's David Hume sporting his turban. But anyway, so that's a bit of silliness regarding picture day and early modern philosophers. Also, as is my custom, I thought I would, just go over a few things about the life and times of David Hume. I don't have a whole lot to say about the life and times of David Hume, but as it is my custom, I'll go ahead and do so. When we're talking about David Hume, right, we're talking about a Scottish philosopher who lived from 1711 to 1776. Right, this post dates him. He comes onto the philosophical scene, more so after Locke and Berkeley, and he is the last of the empiricist philosophers that we'll be studying before we move on to Immanuel Kant. David Hume, he was born, as I said, 1711. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was born into a family of lawyers. He studied at Edinburgh University, and he was supposed to study law at Edinburgh, but he was really not very much interested in the study of law. And he moved on and focused on issues of classics, mathematics, science, and philosophy. And he never actually received a degree at Edinburgh University. And during his time at Edinburgh University, he became an atheist. In 1734, about the age of 23, he moved to France and lived in France for 3 years. And he met various intellectuals in France at that time. Upon his return to the British Isle, he started writing, and Hume, he wrote voluminously in his lifetime. His first published work was the Treatise on Human Nature. In 1739, he published the first two major parts, the first two books of the treatise. In 1740, he completed and published the third book of the Treatise of Human Nature. And the Treatise of Human Nature, it deals a lot with issues in epistemology and metaphysics, but it also deals with important moral issues and the foundations of ethics. And he is well known for his work on the foundations of ethics, though we will be focusing more on his epistemological and metaphysical views. And Hume was very much hoping to be recognized during his own lifetime as a very significant figure in philosophy. And he published, again at a fairly young age, he published the Treatise of Human Nature, but it was not widely read, it was not widely appreciated. Hume famously declared, perhaps he declared this in his autobiography, that his treatise fell stillborn or deadborn from the press. He didn't get the notoriety that he had expected for it. And I think many people believe this contributed to a period of depression that Hume fell into after the publication of the treatise. And it wasn't until 1748 that Hume published philosophy again. And in 1748, he published what we'll be studying, his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And in 1751, he turned around and published what's called the Enquiry Concerning the Principle of Morals. The Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding focuses more on, as I said, epistemological, metaphysical issues, and of course, the Enquiry Concerning the Principle of Morals turns more to the foundations of ethics. These two books, the two Enquiries of David Hume, which were published a number of years after the publication of the treatise, these two books, the two Enquiries, they express ideas that you can find in the treatise, but they are shorter works. The writing is more polished and easier to read. And I think what Hume was doing, I think he was trying to present a shorter, more easily readable account of his philosophy so that he would be more widely read and more widely appreciated. But even the two Enquiries did not make the splash among intellectuals that Hume was hoping for, and he was again disappointed. In 1754, he began work on a comprehensive history of England. In fact, he worked from 1754 to 1762 on a book titled The History of England. And this was a very popular book, and it was very highly regarded and widely read. And so in his own life and times, he was more known for his history of England than for his philosophical views. In 1763, David Hume returned to France and lived for another 3 years. And while there, he went on what could be called the salon circuit. I don't know how much you all know about French intellectual history, but there were these get-togethers at various sites in France. I think usually wealthier patrons would provide settings for intellectuals to gather and engage in dialogue on things like philosophy, politics, science, art, things like this. And David Hume went on this circuit, and he made friends with other French intellectuals such as D'Alembert, Diderot, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He also became friends with the famous English economist Adam Smith during this time. And Hume was a highly regarded participant in the discussions at the salons, and he was evidently quite sociable in the salon circuit. In his later life, he did publish an autobiography called My Own Life, and in later life, he had also written a very famous work in philosophy dealing with theology and philosophy of religion. He wrote the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. I know that some of you have probably encountered this. I think my friend Jeff Chaplin likes to teach the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion and does so often. The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, these were published after his death. They were published posthumously in 1779. David Hume himself, he died of cancer in 1776. So that's a bit about the life and times of David Hume. And I hope I captured those images of him adequately earlier. Now, having said all of this, I would remind you that you should have received my outline of things that are covered in the first three chapters, or I should say the first three sections of Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And I don't know that I'll have all that much to add to what's there on the outline, but maybe I'll have some things to add. But let us turn to Hume's Enquiry, Section 1. The first thing I want to talk about is the two kinds of philosophy that Hume talks about in the Enquiry, Section 1. Hume talks about what he calls moral philosophy. And he equates moral philosophy with what he calls the science of human nature in the first section of the Enquiry. And Hume wants to distinguish between these two different kinds of moral philosophy, these two different approaches to understanding human nature. And just to be clear about this, before I go forward with this, it seems to me like when he's talking about moral philosophy, especially the more difficult or abstract moral philosophy, I don't think he has in mind what today we would regard as moral philosophy. I think what he's calling moral philosophy would actually include epistemology and metaphysics, as well as theories concerning the nature of the mind and how it operates. But regardless, he references all of these as kinds of moral philosophy. He talks, as I said, he talks about a light and easy kind of moral philosophy, which is found in the works of Cicero, La Bruyere, and Addison. And he talks about a more abstract and difficult kind of moral philosophy, which is found in the works of Aristotle, Malebranche, and John Locke. He says that the former kind, the light and easy moral philosophy of Cicero, La Bruyere, and Addison, this former kind, this light kind, gives accounts of the nature of virtue and vice. It gives instruction in how to lead a virtuous life. Whereas the latter, more abstract and difficult philosophy that we can see and that Hume lists as examples in Aristotle, Malebranche, and Locke, this more abstract and difficult philosophy inquires into the fundamental nature of human reason and the very origins of moral principles. Hume says that the majority of persons who are familiar with these two kinds of philosophy, they prefer the light and easy approach, because the latter approach, which inquires into the fundamental nature of human reason, is so difficult and abstract. Now, Hume says that in his own inquiry concerning human understanding, which is what we're reading, he says he will engage in the more difficult kind of philosophy, which focuses on the fundamental nature of human reason. But he says that in doing this, he will do it in such a way as to make it useful to practical matters of human life. He says that the natural world and human nature are such that it is difficult for such abstract and difficult philosophical inquiries to have much hold on the human mind if they are not useful in human action and society. At some point while he's talking about these things, he speaks for nature, and he references basically Mother Nature. Speaking for Mother Nature, he says, "Indulge your passion," I quote here from page 310 of our copy of the Enquiry. "Indulge your passion for science," says Mother Nature, "but let your science be human, such as may have direct reference to action and society." Right? So Hume's trying to point out that, I think here at the beginning of the Enquiry, he's trying to point out that he's going to drag us through some pretty difficult, abstract theories about human nature and knowledge and the nature of reality. But he's trying to indicate that he's doing this not just for the sake of that, but to give us things that could help us overcome problems in our lives and maybe get to a better understanding of reality and ethics. The goal of the Enquiry. Hume, I'm looking to the outline which I've shared with you. Hume proposes to study the nature of understanding so as to exhibit its proper limits. He will try to show that empirical science is legitimate, but abstract metaphysical discourses seeking to prove the existence of God and the existence of immortal souls involve exceeding the limits of human understanding. According to Hume, such metaphysical discourse that, say, tries to prove God's existence or prove that we've got immortal souls, such metaphysical discourse has, quote, the air of science and wisdom, but it doesn't yield genuine knowledge. Hume believes that by getting clear about the nature and limits of the human understanding, we can get clear about what is knowable and what isn't. He will ultimately argue that empirical science and mathematics have an intellectual legitimacy, but traditional metaphysics, with its arguments for God's existence and the immortality of souls, does not. referencing traditional metaphysics that tries to give us arguments for God and immortal souls, Hume would say, right, such traditional metaphysics is, quote, a shelter to superstition and a cover to absurdity and error, end quote. See page 315 of Hume's Enquiry. So it's important to understand that, where the inquiry is going. Ultimately, Hume's going to tell us things about the nature of human understanding and the nature of knowledge that will show to us that, a lot of the metaphysics that has been done, say, by medieval philosophers and even by Descartes and Leibniz, say, who try to give us proof of God's existence, who try to give us some reason to think that we have immortal souls. Hume's going to argue that kind of metaphysics extends beyond what we can reasonably expect to come to know about reality. And so Hume's really, at some level, engaged in critique of metaphysics as it has been understood, in past periods of philosophy, including the rationalist era of the early modern period. So that's what I have to say about the first section. I'd like to move on to section 2, where I feel like Hume starts doing some of the business of his empiricist philosophy. So let us turn to his thoughts on the origin of ideas from section 2, as well as his views on the perceptions of the mind. I have on my outline, regarding the perceptions of the mind, Hume divides all of the perceptions of the human mind into two broad categories. On the one hand, there are impressions. On the other, there are ideas. Impressions are the more lively or vivid perceptions we have when we are seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling things, or having certain emotions such as loving or hating or desiring or fearing, etc. Ideas, he says, are less lively perceptions, which we have when we are remembering our impressions or when we are imagining things, right? So for instance, right now, I look to my left, I see a black television set. It's very vivid and lively to me, my experience of the black television set. There is a black television set in my room, just like in our classroom up in the corner by the door, right? But, and then as I look away from the television set which is there, which gave rise to my impression of the black, rather large television set. When I move away now and I think about that television set, I can form, say, a mental image of that black television set. But that's just an idea. It's not an impression. I don't have, right, as I think about and remember seeing the black television set, my idea of that black television doesn't have the vivacity, the liveliness, the clarity, of the impression I have of the black television set when I am looking at it, right? Or, when I was in high school, I once received an elbow to the gut in a basketball game, and I became very angry and threw this other player on the floor and stood over him and threatened to kick his ass. But it was like a red hot anger at the time. And as I was experiencing red hot anger, I had the impression of anger. But as I sit here talking about this now from memory, the memory of that anger doesn't have the same sort of vivacity as when I actually experienced it. Right? And so I've got the idea of that anger now. But when I actually felt it during that high school basketball game, that was, the impression of anger. Right? So, right? Our minds are loaded with perceptions. Some of those perceptions are ideas. Some are impressions. Impressions arise from actually seeing, smelling, feeling certain things. And the ideas are memories of those impressions or imaginings, right? And for that matter, regarding imagination, right, Hume's got the idea that anything that we imagine is built up from prior impressions, right? For instance, I can imagine a unicorn. I've never had the impression of a unicorn, but I can imagine unicorns, right? And how do I imagine such a thing? Well, I take my experience of horses, my impressions of horses, and I form ideas of horses that way. I also take my experience of horned animals, whether deer or gazelle, and I'm able, right, from those impressions of horses and horned animals, I'm able then to have ideas of those things, and I'm quite capable of amalgamating them, putting them together in ways that I can get the idea, say, of a unicorn. And so, that's sort of how imagination works. According to Hume, we can't imagine things of which we've never had any impression. We can imagine things that we've never directly experienced. I've never directly experienced a unicorn. I've never directly experienced something like the Starship Enterprise. But from my experiences of things like flying vessels and known rocket ships, I can put together in my mind the imagining of something like the Starship Enterprise. Right, so two kinds of perceptions of the mind. Hume also in section 2 talks about on the origin of ideas. Hume says that all our ideas are derived from antecedent impressions, and that goes to something I was talking about. Like his predecessor, John Locke, he rejects the theory of innate ideas. Right? We're not born with any ideas in our mind. All of our ideas are derived from earlier impressions. Right? And in support of this idea that all our ideas are derived from impressions, in section 2, Hume says that he makes the point that, look, blind men have no idea of color, deaf men no idea of sound. He also notes that those who've had no opportunity to experience certain sorts of things can have no ideas of what those things are like. So, for instance, someone who's never had a drink of wine can have no idea of its taste, just for instance. Or perhaps someone who's never heard a violin being played can have no idea of what that sounds like, say. And Hume uses these points to support the idea that all of our ideas are derived from antecedent impressions. And he does make some other points along those lines. In section 2 as well, Hume also wants to talk to us not only about the different kinds of perceptions of the mind, right, impressions and ideas. Not only does he want to give some reason to think that all of our ideas are derived from impressions, he also says some things that have to do with meaning, meaningful discourse, meaningful language use. He says regarding meaningful language use, Hume says that words have meaning only when determinate ideas are connected with them. This belief of his regarding meaning, combined with his views on the origins of ideas, it has an interesting implication for meaningful discourse. Right at the very end of section 2, seems to me he says some things that we could build into an argument that runs like this. And this is on the outline. Point 1. Words have meaning only when determinate ideas are associated with them. Point 2. All ideas are derived from earlier impressions. Therefore, if someone talks of things relating to ideas which cannot be derived from impressions, then what he says is meaningless. Right? So, for instance, one implication of this might be that if you had this view, and And I think John Locke sometimes says things like this. That is to say, I think sometimes John Locke talks about substances as uh, things we know not what, which underlie the perceptual experiences we have of them. So, for instance, the table as it is in itself might be something we know not what that gives rise to our experience of the table's primary and secondary qualities. But if you understand substances as things we know not what, which that serve as the cause for our impressions of them, but we can have no impression of that substance itself. Well, Hume's theory of meaning might imply that that kind of discourse, that kind of understanding of substance is meaningless. I mean, if we think of substances as things we know not what, which can never be perceived but cause our perceptions, this might be a place where Hume might want to say that's really not a meaningful conception of substance because there's no impression from which that conception of substance could be derived, you see. But regardless, he does say some things that are interesting about meaningful discourse. And frankly, what he says there, I don't know how many of you have ever had philosophy of language, but in the 20th century, there was an approach to the philosophy of language called logical positivism, sometimes called logical empiricism. And what Hume is saying here about meaningful discourse really has always struck me as quite similar to things that the logical positivists are saying about meaningful discourse. Interesting that the logical positivists engage in significant criticism of traditional metaphysics themselves, just as Hume does. And a lot of the times I look at Hume as a precursor to 20th century logical positivism. You might wonder who were these logical positivists of the 20th century. These would be philosophers like A.J. Ayer and Rudolf Carnap, Otto Neurath. Ludwig Wittgenstein was actually a member of the positivist movement for a while himself, before heading off in different philosophical directions. But anyway, I don't have more to say about section 2 of the inquiry either at this point. It is a short section. Let's talk about section 3 of the inquiry, which is also quite short. I think section 3 of the inquiry is too short. I think it might have been handy for Hume to give even more examples to illustrate some of the points that he's making there. But Hume's inquiry, section 3, here Hume maintains that inherent to the human mind, there are natural principles that lead us to make connections among our ideas and to relate our ideas in certain sorts of ways. These principles, these natural principles for associating the ideas that we have in our mind, these principles, they come in 3 kinds. There's the principle of resemblance, the principle of contiguity, and the principle of cause and effect. Regarding the principle of resemblance, Hume would want to say that when one impression or idea enters our mind, and when that idea or impression resembles some other idea or impression that we've had of something else, then we're naturally led to think of that other idea. Right? So for instance, when I see a 2-story white house, when I'm traveling in southeast Cedar Rapids, when I have the impression, when I have the visual impression of a 2-story white house in southeastern Cedar Rapids, my mind might immediately go towards the idea of my own house, which is a 2-story white house, you see. Or when I see the domed Capitol building of Iowa in Des Moines, it leads me to think of other domed Capitol buildings which look similar, and perhaps my mind goes to the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C., right? Or if I see, I don't know, a pretty brunette who's about 5 feet 4 inches tall, on the campus of Coe College, say, my mind might immediately be drawn to my wife, who's also a pretty brunette of 5 feet 4 inches, say, just by associating the similarity in the looks of these two women. Regarding the principle of contiguity, right? Well, to understand this principle, we need to understand contiguity. Contiguous things for Hume, these are things that are close to one another in either space or time, right? What Hume wants to say is that when we have the idea of one thing which is near to another, either spatially or temporally, our minds are naturally led to think of the other thing that is found close to it. Okay? So, for instance, if I'm in Miami traveling and my wife shows me a picture of our neighbor's house, and now I've got the impression of my neighbor's house, my mind is quite likely to go ahead and think about and form the idea of our house, which sits right next to it, right? Or if I start thinking about Hickok Hall on the campus of Coe College, I might just naturally be led to think about the Dow's Fine Arts Building, which is situated right next to Hickok Hall, for instance, right? And so, right, this is another principle by which our mind naturally associates ideas. And also, again, you can have contiguity temporally. Let's see. If I think of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and I think about the intermediate stages of the song, my mind might naturally be led to think about the concluding stages of the song, which follow right immediately upon the conclusion of the intermediate stages of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And of course, that is an extended, right? The Ode to Joy is played out over an extended period of time, right? And so, right, just thinking about a middle part of Beethoven's great Ode to Joy, I might be led to think about the latter parts of it. I won't start singing or whistling or humming Ode to Joy to spare you of such indignities. Right, so I've talked about the principle of resemblance, which is a natural principle for associating ideas according to Hume. I've talked about the principle of contiguity. Lastly, there is the principle of cause and effect, and Hume will have much to say about cause and effect in the subsequent chapters of the Enquiry. But look, cause and effect. This is Hume, again, we have a natural tendency to relate ideas in terms of cause and effect. Hume says that when we have the idea of one thing or one event that is taken to be a cause of something else, we are naturally led then to think of that which it causes, the effect. Or when we think of something that is typically the effect of something else that is cause, well then, and when we think of the thing that is effect, we are naturally led and often led to think of its cause, right? So for instance, if I see a ball heading towards a fragile glass window, I have that impression of a ball heading to a fragile glass window. I'm likely going to start thinking about that glass is going to break, right? Because the breaking of the glass would be effect of that ball striking the window. If I see, Luke Vanderschaft swinging a fist right at my head, I'm immediately going to think of pain in my face, because getting slugged in the head often leads to pain in the face, just for instance, right? Or if I see Zachary Morris with a black eye, right? And I know that he was partying last night with Henry Hoytia. Well, knowing that black eyes are frequently the result of being struck, my mind might, and knowing that he was partying with Henry Hoytia, I might suspect that he's been slugged by Henry Hoytia or one of the others of this rough crowd that Zachary Morris spends time with. And so that's a bit more about these different principles for associating ideas. And as I said, Hume will talk a lot more about cause and effect in the reading that I want you to do for next time. For next time, I want you to carefully read section 4 of Hume's Enquiry. And I will talk about section 4 the next time we meet. But at this point, I hope you understand, a bit about the life and times of Hume. I hope you have got some understanding of where this text is heading, and hope you have some idea, some good idea of his views on the different kinds of perceptions of the mind. I hope you understand his theory of meaning. I hope you understand that he regards all ideas as derived from impressions. I hope you know what impressions are, and I hope you have some understanding of these 3 principles that he regards as natural principles of the mind that lead us to associate ideas in terms of resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. See you again soon. Bye-bye.